All right, guys. It looks like the LinkedIn stream is disconnected. We are gonna just make it roll on YouTube and X. I'm gonna do quick introductions, introduce everybody. I'm gonna drop the YouTube link on LinkedIn for everybody who wanted to participate. But let's dive right in. I have former Massachusetts Lieutenant Governor Kerry Healey, also the former president of Babson College here today. We are going to talk about higher ed. I am fascinated to hear her perspectives. And we have the queen of alternatives, Shana Sissel, on the program, CEO of Banrion Capital. I am outnumbered today. I've got two Massachusetts natives. I'm the only Philly guy. Shana wants to talk basketball. I guess I will at some point. But let's start off talking about the craziness going on with higher education right now, specifically at Harvard. But we'll break it out and talk about the entire industry. I'm gonna Carrie, I want to give you an open-ended question because I've got to drop this YouTube link into LinkedIn so people
Okay.
can tune in. So I'm going to give you a very open-ended question, Carrie. What is going on? Let's start with the Harvard situation. What's going on there? Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're seeing is Harvard is being used as an example right now. An example is being made of Harvard. I think that this administration likes to do shows of power and to make it clear to other people in whatever sphere that is, whether it's law firms or immigrants or whoever it is, they like to make it clear. Or whether it's China, that if you behave in a certain way, there will be consequences. And so right now in the higher ed sphere, Harvard has actually, shown a lot of spine, we will clean up our own act. Not everything was perfect here. But we will do it within the boundaries of our own governance, and we will not, as a private educational institution, allow the government to come in and tinker with our internal mechanisms and governance. And I think they're exactly right. Now, granted, I'm a Harvard graduate, so I take special interest in this. But I haven't always agreed with the way Harvard has governed itself. And I did think that they needed to stand up to anti-Semitism more. And I did think that they needed to be more assertive in terms of how they handled student protest. And I thought that there were a lot of ways that they could improve. And I've been vocal to them in private and a little bit more in public around those concerns. But never once would I have thought that the better alternative would be for the US government in any form to become so involved with the governance of higher education. So right now, what I see here is a standoff. And Harvard has a great deal of resources, but no university has so many resources that they're absolutely insulated from the kind of threats that are being levied against Harvard at this moment. So the most recent threats that have been put out there, have to do with removing tax-exempt status. Obviously, no university budget could withstand that if they were suddenly viewed to be a profit-making organization as opposed to a nonprofit organization. And then again, the admission of international students. What I find interesting about this is that if there is not only just a chilling effect on international students coming to the U.S., but if there were an actual prohibition to disallow international students to come to the U.S., I would say that maybe half of all higher education institutions in the U.S. Would have a financial crisis. So many completely balance their budget on the full freight tuition, which is paid by international students. There's no financial aid available to international students in the US. And so not just private institutions balance their budget in that way, but not too long ago, many public universities and colleges also caught on to the idea that, that those folks who are coming from overseas could make up that deficit and could allow them to give scholarships to US students who otherwise would not be able to attend. So the unintended consequences of trying to cut off access to international students, just one piece of that is that there's going to be far less financial aid available to needy US students who want to attend those same universities and colleges.
Right. And we are going to talk about the trade wars later, but I love that you drew the comparisons to how the higher ed battle is playing out and also the economic and geopolitical battles that are playing out right now. I was on campus at my alma mater, Temple University, yesterday. They had a town hall. Temple University, for anybody following, and people who follow me on X, they know I've done some muckraking around the leadership problems going on at that university, the safety problems. I've been a big advocate for student safety, and Temple. I love my alma mater more than anything, but they have some serious flaws when it comes to student safety. I want students graduating, leaving there with degrees, not trauma. All right. That is what I've stood for, what I've always stood for. Shana, you met one of my former employees years ago, who was attacked on campus. And that turned me into Animal Mother from Full Metal Jacket when one of my people gets attacked. And that's when I started doing deeper research into how these institutions are run and where their priorities are. I know the Trump administration is, wants to make Harvard their example and are maybe being unfair with, a lot of the things they're throwing at them right now. But these institutions have real flaws too that need to be talked about in a civil way.
Yeah, but I just want to interrupt, if you don't mind. I agree with Kerry in that, the government should not be getting involved with the private institutions and how they're run to the extent that they are. Harvard's faced significant backlash from its own alumni in this. And honestly, that's going to have a bigger impact. Harvard's endowment's the largest endowment of any of the universities that exist in the United States. In fact, most students that attend Harvard pay almost nothing, regardless of their financial situation, because Harvard, gives so much aid to their US-based students to the point where, it doesn't really matter what it says the tuition is on their website because nobody pays that other than, as Kerry pointed out, the international students who don't get the benefit of aid. But Harvard has some alumni with really deep pockets. Bill Ackman's probably the most visible one. But when they put the pressure on, you saw change happen from Harvard because they can't afford to turn off their deep-pocketed alumni. And that is going to put more pressure on any institution more than the government would. And we don't live in a society where the government should have that kind of influence over private institutions. Now, I would argue that the safety part is an important aspect. And that really comes down to how higher education and that dogma looks at law enforcement in general. But at the end of the day, most of that stuff comes full circle because everybody can hate the police until they need the police. And if it becomes, and we saw this in Minneapolis, nobody wanted the police until they realized that without the police, there's complete lawlessness. And so the universities do have to be better on student safety. But again, we live in a society, a capitalist society, where people speak with their wallets. And if schools start having a lot of applicants because there's a safety issue, that will put the pressure on where it needs to be. And we saw some of that during COVID, where you saw people starting to look at universities that didn't have such a left-leaning reputation, start to look at other universities who were more open. Down south in particular, the southern universities suddenly saw a huge uptick in enrollment and applications because of that. So, it takes a little bit longer. But, if the right people put the pressure on, Bill Ackman, again, is a major example of that. A lot of changes were made at Harvard simply because he was so outspoken.
Yeah, or Mark,
and here in Philadelphia at Penn too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of examples of prominent alumni being extremely effective in creating high-level change, the change in the presidency of these universities themselves. And that comes with changes in policy. These institutions usually evolve slowly. So you're not going to, you're not going to see the kind of rapid, shifts, and they endure from administration to administration. Now, one lesson that I think is being learned now is that that accepting federal dollars has consequences, and so the very perhaps reasonable, if you will, if an administration doesn't approve of a particular institution, perhaps you don't want to invest in it, perhaps you don't want to be funding things there. So maybe withdrawing that funding was a reasonable carrot or stick, depending on how you're viewing it. But there are other implications to the removal of funding from our major universities, especially our research institutions. And I would like to talk about that, because if you're really concerned about American competitiveness, if you're worried about, what our GDP is going to be in the future, if you're worried about whether our companies will have leaders who have new ideas, whether they're able to innovate, will they have the scientific discoveries necessary to create the next generation of computers or pharmaceuticals or whatever we're looking for. All that basic research is being done at universities now. And many of our best companies and most successful companies are spun out of those labs. So we are now going to see just a halt, to an entire generation of research scientists and their research. We're going to lose a generation of PhDs who we will not be able to get back. And these aren't the PhDs who are studying Romance literature. These are the ones that are doing hard science and are the ones that are going to actually run the companies and make the discoveries that make the American economy grow. And so there is actually almost nothing that this administration could do that could hobble our economy in the long run more than freezing the funding to these university labs and research facilities.
And I think to Kerry's point, the international student aspect of it is a major component. I feel like every administration talks about making the path to citizenship easier for folks that come in through the universities who could potentially help our economy. If you think about, say, like Google, Google is a perfect example of a major US company that was started by individuals that were international students at one point and stayed. And I don't think you can underestimate the influence that allowing international students to come and live in the US and be exposed to our cultural values, and that entrepreneurial spirit, that ability to build companies can have on influencing just global politics in general. I think the more you can have people come to the US, adopt our culture, contribute to our economy, and then demonstrate to their home country and the citizens in those countries, the benefits of the US, that's the better influence than the other way around that has been done. And I've always been a huge supporter of the accelerated, easier path to citizenship for folks that are coming in on a student visa, because at the end of the day, one of the things that makes America so great is we are one of the few countries that does allow for open immigration and a path to citizenship. Now, my mom's an immigrant. So she came here, she became a US citizen, and I found that most folks that do it that way have very strong feelings on immigration policy here. But I think one of the best ways to reduce illegal immigration is to have a very clear path to citizenship that doesn't cost a ridiculous amount. I have a friend that's here that came here from England that's going through this process. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to become a US citizen, which is insane to me. I think that if somebody comes here, demonstrates that they are adopting a cultural values, i.e. not bringing negative cultural values here, because we have seen some of that, and are going to school and contributing to our economy in a positive way, potentially building new business, doing research that's important, that can spearhead major developments, whether it be through pharmaceutical, through through technology, AI, or whatever it is. That's the right way. There has to be a better path to citizenship, a clearer one that is not based on are you rich, and that encourages the kind of immigration that we want to see, the contributory kind. The folks coming in doing the jobs that Americans don't want, that becomes a huge topic of conversation. If you made the path to citizenship less expensive and not as cumbersome, then a lot of the folks, I believe, that are coming in illegally, but for the right reasons, would come in legally and still contribute to society. Is there a component of illegal immigration that is negative? Yes, but I would argue it's not a large component. And we need to find a way to kind of expedite that. And the student visa is one of the easiest ways to encourage the kind of immigration that we want. And then looking to reform the path to immigration here, path to citizenship here when you do immigrate, I think is important. My mom didn't have to pay a lot of money to become a U.S. citizen. She didn't have to jump through hoops. This was, 1960s-ish. It was a very different path to citizenship prior to that. My dad's parents were also immigrants. Same thing, came over through Ellis Island. There wasn't like this hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost. It was come here, be a contributor to society, show that you learn the language, understand our history, and here you go. And we want to continue to be that place in the world, because that's what's made us the most, forward-looking, influential, and quite frankly, the most economically impactful country in the world.
Yeah. And the student deportations is a big part of this conversation that we're having too. I love that we're pivoting into immigration, because that's a big part of the storyline playing out right now, and a big part of this current administration's agenda. They are looking for international activists who have participated in protests and whatnot. And it's such a complicated issue.
Yes, that's what they're looking for.
Right to you. Yeah.
There are, in fact, people who, are causing danger in the U.S. who are here on student visas, then they shouldn't be here. But that said, just the almost malicious or random deportation of students has already had a chilling effect on whether or not foreign families, who all love their children just as much as we love our children, would be willing to send their children to the United States. Many people are reconsidering whether they would travel to the U.S., given the way many international arrivals are being treated now by immigration. And so I think that the chilling effect on our economy, certainly on the economics of these various educational institutions, could be ruinous. Could genuinely be ruinous for some of these universities. And what we're going to see is universities and colleges that are going to have to become much smaller, much more elite, because only the elites will be able to go, because there won't be financial aid, perhaps, from the federal government in the form of Pell Grants, because if you close down the Department of Education, who's going to be administering the Pell Grants? Who's going to be overseeing the student loan programs? Maybe it will be well done by whoever inherits these responsibilities, but we don't know. So there's that whole chilling effect in terms of who could, be able to attend colleges and universities. And then we're also cutting off the high end. We're also cutting off the students who can come in and actually pay for those scholarships internally for domestic students. So we're going to see a narrowing of who educational institutions serve. And I, at least, benefited from some of the earliest efforts at Harvard to diversify the kind of people who they could admit. In the past, it used to be only, usually young men from the certain number of prep schools in the East, in the Northeast. I came from a public high school in Daytona Beach, Florida. My dad was a military vet, and my mom was an elementary public school teacher. We didn't have any money. There's no way that I could have gone to Harvard without at least some support. And yes, I worked, and yes, my mom worked, and yes, everything, it wasn't easy, but it was easier than if there had been no financial aid at all. And so what I'm beginning to see here is a situation where the middle classes are not going to be able to attend higher educational institutions, and the elites will simply become more elite, and those who are without means are going to become poorer and poorer, especially in a situation where the tariffs are creating such a high level of inflation, and inevitably this is what's going to occur, that it will hit the middle classes and low income families, and higher education is going to be the last thing on their menu.
Sure.
Well, I would argue that we put too much emphasis on higher education. I did a podcast recently with a firm that we work with at Banrion that does real estate investing called Scholastic Capital. And we got into this discussion about the trades, right? And one of the things he said that kind of stuck with me was, we are at the point where there are more plumbers retiring than are coming into the space. And most people aren't talking about it, but the impact that has on housing is substantial, right? Because it becomes much more expensive to build a house if like the number of potential contractors that are available is limited, and then the cost of those contractors goes up, or they don't exist at all, and then you can't meet the requirements of the town from a regulatory perspective for your permits and things of that nature. I just think we put way too much emphasis on higher education. I think for certain skills, it makes sense.
We'd gone too far in the other direction. Certainly employers were using college degrees as just a sorting mechanism so that they could hire people more easily and not really have to go through all the resumes. But I've been a huge advocate of the idea that we needed more, certainly more occupational training and certificate programs and all of these other pathways to making a decent living that do not include a college education. But what I wouldn't like to see is I wouldn't like to see a college education again become the sole property of the elite. I don't think that we want to live in a country where the only people who can have a college education and the only people who can have those executive jobs and those leadership jobs are people who's had money to begin with. That does not seem like America to me.
And I do want to point out along those lines of, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But again, I reiterate, I think sometimes employers put too much emphasis on where you went to school. A lot of times it's based on your alumni and the network. But a lot of people don't realize this. But the vast majority of Fortune 500 CEOs come from the University of Wisconsin system, not Harvard, not Yale, but more CEOs came through the University of Wisconsin system, not necessarily Madison, but just University of Wisconsin system in general, than anywhere else. Michigan's also very influential in that standpoint. So these public institutions do have value. I think, Kerry being the former president of Babson, and I got my my graduate degree from Bentley, so we're a little bit of rivals in that sense. But one of the two things Babson and Bentley have in common is the nature of those two schools are very focused on areas where there's value, right? So Babson's known for its entrepreneurial program, its business program. It's really focused on that. Bentley is accounting and finance. The two schools don't have you can't major in English, and I think we got, to your point, Kerry, too hung up on, do you even have a degree? It doesn't really matter what it's in. It was that was how you screened. I think, focusing on having people gain actual productive skills that are going to translate well into careers is way more important. And that should be the focus. And sometimes that means that instead of going and getting yourself a philosophy degree, you go into the trades and you learn how to be an electrician or a plumber. And we took away, there's not a lot of trade schools anymore. There used to be home economics and shop classes that don't exist anymore, where you could learn those skills and get exposed to them and decide, oh, this is something that I'm interested in doing. We don't have that anymore. And we also don't have programs necessarily like the colleges get from a governmental standpoint of financial aid and things for trade related programs. I know there are some, but there could be more. And we should have a more balanced view so that the people who go get higher education, whether it be through the trades or through a university, are actually getting skills that are going to be productive and translate well into careers, and stop making it just about being in college, regardless of what your degree is in. So like more engineers, more people related to business. I went to UMass Amherst. We had like this crazy like facility management program. They had this whole landscape program where people learned how to build golf courses and things like that. And like those are practical skills. I would argue that like an English degree is not necessarily a practical skill if that's what's being like, if what you got your degree in doesn't really matter. It's just that you have a degree. We put too much emphasis on degrees in that sense. I think it really is the practical application of something that can be translated into the economic return. And that's what we should focus on. And that doesn't necessarily mean universities, but I think getting an additional education following high school in a number of different ways is what we should be focusing on, what should we should be incentivizing. And I think that will allow for a more fair playing field and not just the rich get richer. But to Kerry's point, I think the way everything is structured today very much favors folks that have money getting into the best schools, having, the best alumni networks, getting the best jobs and so on and so forth. I'm fortunate. I went to UMass Amherst. I have no pedigree. My family, to your point, Kerry, we have a similar background. My mom was an inner city school teacher in Worcester, and my dad was a Worcester cop. And so like I have no pedigree. My entire family's immigrants. My dad's parents were from Poland. My mom came from Ireland. And I've built a business. I've become very successful. And so I'm like exhibit A of what happens if you allow somebody who is smart access to higher education, and again, translating that into economic value, and make it a fair playing field from that standpoint. So which brings the emphasis should be on getting the education that translates to economic value.
And I'm going to jump back in and piggyback. I do want to, we're going to talk about trade wars and everything playing out right now, which is the other big story beyond higher education this week right now. Kerry, I want to go back to you and I want to piggyback off of Shana's points. One thing we haven't talked about yet that I'm biased because I came from a community college background, took a dual enrollment program, zero debt while I went to community college. I waited tables close to full time, paid my tuition off. I'd put my tuition on my credit card, pay it off by the end of the semester. And it set me up on a path because you know what? When I went to community college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I found public relations, my calling, through community college, went to Temple, then I took on debt, but was able to figure things out. Can we, Kerry, agree, disagree? Can we destigmatize the community college model? Because I feel like so many employers see that.
Yeah,
especially Ivy League. I know you're an Ivy League person. Some Ivy League employers will look at that not in a good way.
But I love that you just mentioned it, right? So first you came out with, "Hi, I went to Temple," right? And then now we've talked about, actually, I started at the community college level, and so did I. At 16, I started going to Daytona Beach Community College, and it was the first community college that actually had a computer science program because it was at the end of the space program. And a lot of the GE engineers who didn't want to move back up north to the cold, they said, we want to stay in Daytona Beach, Florida. And so they went to the local community college and they bought a big IBM 1130 and they were teaching, kids in Daytona Beach how to do computer programming in 1976. And so I had an opportunity at a community college to do something that, quite honestly, they were still kind of playing catch up at Harvard and MIT. They weren't doing as well, actually, as what I was doing, working with NASA rocket scientists when, at a local community college. And there are a lot of gems like that out there. And I think that people should probably talk more about how they used community college as a step up, as a way to get skills, as a way to get going into higher education or make the whole process cost less. And maybe people like you and me should just talk about it more and be much more out there and say, yes, I went to Daytona Beach Community College and I went to Harvard, or I went to community college and I went to Temple. I think that narrative alone would destigmatize it a great deal. I also want to say that I think that community colleges need to be recast at this point. And this is, my own personal philosophy, but I would love to see national service become part of what we do to rebuild the fabric of our nation, to build a common experience for everyone in the country. And I think part of that could be the kind of training that Shana is talking about, that sort of practical training, whether it's, learning to do a job that does not necessarily require a college education during that year of national service. And I think it should be done in conjunction with community colleges. There should probably be a 13th year of education that is provided for all Americans, so that they have that choice at the end of the time. So they have some training that would allow them to go and live a decent life, whether they chose to go to college or not. And if they do choose to go to college, that maybe it would cost less because they have a step up and a leg up on that. So that's maybe for another podcast. You want to talk about that, but I think national service is something that we need to take seriously. And I would hope that there would be bipartisan support for thinking how we could reuse our entire community college system to support that.
Well, I think that we have taken the stigma away of community college for athletics. It's incredibly common for athletes, especially ones that end up in the pros, to do a year or two at a community college because they're not academically ready for an institution. And so they do that so that they can then go and play at a high level institution. That's actually really common. And there's no stigma in that. My uncle went to Brown, but he did a year at a prep school, Cushing Academy. Now, obviously that's not community college, but there's no reason community college couldn't kind of fill that void. Because he wanted to play football and he wasn't academically ready to go to Brown. And so he did a year there, played football there, and then was able to go to Brown on a scholarship. Now, that was a million years ago. But I also want to point out the military can also be a place where people learn skills. People think of military and automatically associate it with war. But my Uncle Ronnie was in the Air Force and during the 60s and 70s. And he actually learned how to code. And so when he came out, he never got a college degree at all, but he ended up being extremely successful in his career because when he got out of the military, he was one of only a few people that knew how to code anything. And coming into the 80s, when computers became a thing, he was able to have a very senior executive role, building and coding software, helping with hardware and things of that nature because of what he learned in the military. And a lot of the innovation that comes out of this country that doesn't come through, the innovation of through immigration or through the universities, a lot of that comes through the military. A lot of the internet, email, like all of that was military based. So, I think that there's a lot of different paths to success.
Projects start at universities with government funding. So we can't forget how important the funding that is being just used to manipulate universities right now is to the future of the country, the future of the military, the future of our businesses. It's not a joke, and it's not a trivial thing that only hurts people at Harvard if you pull out a couple $1 billion of funding for basic science from Harvard, and it's not just going to hurt the people at Columbia or at any of these other schools that are being punished by having their research funding withdrawn. That's going to hurt us all.
I agree.
Tariff tantrum. Radical pivot, but not really, because we're seeing the massive changes that are going on with American culture, the American economy, everything else over the past couple of months. The trade wars, Shana, I want to start with you on this one. Break down what is playing out right now. If there's anything we should be optimistic about, if there's anything we should be terrified about, what is going on right now?
So it's funny. I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, And I always say we got to separate our politics from our policy as investors, because how you feel politically can really color how you look at the markets, and not the best way. So when you separate politics from policy, and the reason I mentioned that is because I had done like a little rant on Instagram stories about kind of how I feel, because I've been getting so many text messages from people being like, are you freaked out about the market? I was like, not even a little bit. And they were like, but why not? And I was like, because if you separate politics from policy, successful investors can do that. Look at everything through the lens of policy and how that impacts business. And then you pick winners and losers that way. And just, you can't have a political opinion. In fact, I worked for John Rogers for several years over at Ariel Investments. John is a very well-known Democrat, very supportive of the Democratic Party, very close with former President Obama. And I've sat in investment committee meetings with John where like he was supportive of policy that wasn't coming from the Democrats because it was good for the stocks that he liked. And he was probably the poster child for what I mean between, separating politics from policy. And the conversation I had with my friend is I did this little rant on Instagram talking about my opinion on the tariffs. And my opinion on the tariffs is you got to look at the administration and you got to look at the psychology of the individual that are doing these things. He wrote a book called The Art of a Deal. He is all about like anchoring to the most extreme and then bringing people to the table, because it's all about making the deal so that he looks like he won. Right. And if you anchor to the biggest extreme, you're more likely to get the outcome you want, because the anchoring bias and cognitive psychology is a real thing. Where you start the negotiation will largely influence where the negotiation ends. And if it's more extreme to the most extreme thing that they would never want to do, they think they're winning, even though if you would anchor them kind of in the center, you're probably going to get a deal that's not as favorable to you. So that's what he's doing. Also keeping in mind that the psychology of this president is that he likes to win. He's very, very aware of the perception. And if for any reason he thinks he's losing, and we've already seen this, he will pivot overnight, like in hours, he will pivot. When we saw the treasury market like react very unfavorably to some of this, that was when all these pivots occurred. So he's very much taking the temperature of the room at all times, and we'll go to the most extreme, see how it goes. And then as the temperature in the room changes, he will change. And because this president, it's all about winning, right? It's all about winning. How can he win? But also winning involves like getting more people on your side and feeling like you did something to help other people. So in terms of the tariffs, we do have some blueprint for this from the first administration, but a lot of it is about deal making. A lot of it is about going and being the most extreme, to have that anchoring bias, to say I won, and to be able to come back and say, see, look what I did. In the meantime, it's chaos, because government doesn't usually work this way. There's more diplomacy involved. There's not as much shouting from the rooftops about how I'm the best and whatever. And there's negotiations are slow moving. That's not been the case here because of the nature of how this president does deal making. He's not doing it in a diplomatic way. He's doing it the way he would have done it in the corporate world, which they don't jive together. And it makes the market nervous because, the market wants clarity. And the other problem is because he can change on a dime, it's really hard to have any prediction of how these things end up. But what I feel really confident about is that the most extreme that people are freaking out about is the least likely scenario. It really is.
I do want to just do one correction. Donald Trump was never in the corporate world. The Trump company was always a private business. He's never he
never had private business, and he was negotiating deals. And because I have guys who dealt with him in the debt side when I worked at Fidelity, a bunch of guys that did that. Just because he didn't have a publicly traded company, it doesn't mean that you don't have the corporate business sense. He was always about the art of the deal, always about getting the best deal. Wasn't necessarily the most successful business person. I would argue he wasn't, but he had charisma and he went out there and he was boisterous and whatever. And he's taken that into the Oval Office. Again, that comes down to separating politics from policy and understanding the psychology of the person that's driving all of this. At the end of the day, he's very sensitive to being seen as a winner. That's what he wants to be seen as. And he will pivot on a dime if he thinks he's not going to be seen as a winner. And understanding that psychology about him is why I'm not freaked out about any of this, because I don't think we are going to end up at the most extremes, because that would be negatively impactful for the U.S. economy. And he doesn't want to be known as the president that put us into like a deep depression or whatever. So he's going to spin on the dime.
I'm having trouble with your feed. I want to pivot over to Kerry. Kerry, are we in a recession right now?
I don't think we know yet, but okay. Unlike Shana, I think that whether or not the administration wins in these negotiations, that I think the real question will be, do the American people win? Is this ultimately going to accomplish, if we accept the approach at face value and say that we are going to be trying to raise tariffs in order to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and that we will be somehow better off as a result. I think that let's say maybe 2 million manufacturing jobs are brought back to the U.S. That would probably be about the maximum you could expect from this. Will those jobs actually be there in the way that we imagine them from back in the day? Will they not be automated? Are we not going to be losing a lot of jobs anyway to AI? If they bring the factories there, will they just all be machinery, robotics, doing all the jobs that we were imagining? And if we do suffer through this, this period, and there was some suggestion that there would be a period of downturn. I don't know whether it would be a recession, but some struggle. Will life for the average American be better? Will our food prices be lower? Will we be able to afford cars? Will we be able to build houses? Will there be enough housing built? Because of the cost of building, that we will, have lower cost of housing in the long run. I can't see how it turns out well. I even just imagining that, in fact, today the administration was meeting with Italy and Japan and Mexico. So yes, people are coming to the table, as a result of these extreme actions. So there will be negotiations, and they'll be on a much expedited basis from the normal type of trade negotiations. But will the outcome actually be beneficial for the American economy and for the Americans consumer, especially low-income consumers? I don't think so. I actually think it's going to be worse off. How much worse off, I don't know.
Dave Chappelle on SNL a couple months ago made a great point. He said, "I want to wear Jordans. I don't want to make them."
Right.
And when you talk about this protectionist economy and agenda that the new administration's building, listen, I'm not smart enough to know how this is all going to play out. I don't even think people in the White House have any idea how this is all going to play out.
Why financial literacy is so important,
opinion.
by the way.
Shana, go ahead. And
I said this is why financial literacy is so important, because Dave Chappelle, he was right, but somebody else mentioned it with like this trade deficit thing. Trade deficits sometimes are necessary. So, the example that goes around a lot is Colombia, right? Like, we can't produce coffee beans, but Colombia can. And there's not a lot that we can give Colombia that they can't produce themselves or whatever. So we end up with a trade deficit because we cannot in any way, shape, or form produce coffee. And coffee is a major, demand here in the US. So there's always going to be a trade deficit with countries that do something that we can't do internally. And so trade deficits are not a bad thing, folks. This idea that if we have a trade deficit, that's bad is based on lack of education. And I think a lot of this is, financial literacy should be in schools for this very reason. It would make the American public smarter and be able to understand that like some of what's being proposed is ridiculous. But also, it would make our political leaders smarter and not propose things that are ridiculous and have unintended consequences, which America has found has hurt us many, many times over. Having that lack of financial literacy, that understanding of how financial markets, capital markets work, how trade works, how supply demand works. Like, it's crazy to me. There's just not enough people understand it. And then when you try to explain it to them, they look at you like you have two heads. And that gets back to where I started. Like, when you ask me about the trade wars and the trade deficits, like I'm looking at it from the standpoint of an investor, right? A recession, no recession. Quite frankly, I made more money for my clients and for myself in the worst markets. So recessions are typically good. It takes a lot of excess out of the system. That's how an economic cycle works, is like you go up, then it slows down, and then it goes negative because it gets too excessive, and then you come back up, and like you can make it so they're not as extreme, but the cycle needs to exist as the cycle for a reason. Like anything, I don't think we're in a recession. Our consumer numbers, even though confidence is low, the Americans are nothing if not like to spend money. In fact, I would argue that the American consumer drives the entire global economy because we consume more stuff than anybody, because our American cultural values stuff more than anything, and people want to have the coolest stuff. So the consumers are continuing to spend. I think the bigger problem is the employment market. So the tariffs put companies kind of on pause. It can cause them to lay people off, furlough people. And the one thing that is true is if you don't have a job or you're afraid that you're going to lose your job, you don't spend money. That's the only time that that's true. And that is my bigger concern. So paying more attention to how all of this impacts employment, I think is important. And we are starting to see cracks in the labor market. And I was actually taken aback by the comments from the Fed chairman yesterday, because I think that, the Fed always makes a mistake. And the fact that they haven't to this point, it means that they're going to make one. And I think this could be that point. Him saying that he doesn't want to do anything because he doesn't know how the tariffs are going to impact it, while we are clearly seeing cracks in the economy and in the market and in employment, is something that, that he should be more concerned about. And the fact that he said he's not going to cut rates when the treasury markets are going straight up, which is exactly what we don't need, the yields going up the way that they are, is all problematic. And so I need people to step back and think about policy, not politics. And in that lens, there will be winners and losers, and great investors will make money in this market, but that it will be almost at the expense of the average American. And it's not that great investors want negative things to happen to the average American. It's just that great investors can separate politics from policy and take advantage of behavioral extremes. And that's why they're getting, people don't like that, because it feels like you made money off a bad thing. It's like Paulson during the financial crisis. He saw a weakness, he leaned into it, he made a ton of money, but people say like he made money like through other people's pain. I mean, that's generally how physics works anyways.
So I think that the politics, though, of the last election cycle and the mandate that the Trump administration came into office with was an economic one. It had to do with economic policies. I think that lower income voters said, here's someone who's going to focus on bringing down the cost of living. Everyone was talking about the cost of eggs, but it was really overall the cost of groceries, the cost of housing, the cost of transportation, and so forth. And that was the promise that was put out there, by the Trump administration. And then on the Wall Street side, the promise was basic Reaganomics, that there was going to be smaller government, there was going to be less regulation, there were going to be lower taxes on corporations and individuals, and that's all recognizable and knowable. I mean, this was the 1980s all over again. This was like core Reaganomics. But if you layer the tariff policy on top of that, then suddenly it doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Then it's not, those economic policies are not going to work for anyone, not for the average voter, and not for people on Wall Street. And so I think that you're going to start to see the political coalition that brought the Trump administration into power fracturing over the economic consequences of the tariff policy.
Yeah, I think a lot of corporations supported a lot of what the Trump was saying during the election cycle, because there is truly, in some countries, American companies are at a disadvantage, China being the most notable, intellectual property being stolen, protections in that sense, that's important. And companies really got behind that, but tariffs don't solve that problem at all. And they came in thinking that there was something going to be done to make a more even playing field for American companies in certain countries. But it's gone so much further than that. And I think American people were thinking, oh, okay, American will now get more of a fair shake. And we're starting to see, obviously, that that's not what's being done here. I think some of the policy, like the fentanyl tariffs, make sense. But like the retaliatory tariffs, not so much. I do think some of what has been done in terms of like other countries had placed, meaningful tariffs on our goods, and we weren't necessarily reciprocating, is us reciprocating, bringing back again, because the American consumer is undefeated here. And at the end of the day, we want to be able to sell to the American consumer, are getting tariffs lowered on American goods. And then subsequently, the tariffs on other countries are going away. But the China stuff and the actual problems that the corporate executives got behind Trump on are not being solved by this tariff thing at all.
I want to pivot, and Shana, that's actually a very good transition. When we talk about people's political affiliations and commitment, I call it tribalism, as a lot of people do. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of tribalism, and that goes on all spectrums. I'm a big believer in the horseshoe theory of politics. You've got me, I call myself Mr. Moderate. I'm right at the top of the horseshoe. And then you got the extremes down there. And the extremes have a lot more in common with each other than those of us at the top of the horseshoe. In my opinion, y'all don't have to agree with me. Kerry, I want to talk about some of the work you're doing with the Forward Party, which is a bipartisan coalition. And I think some people might be hearing this message for the first time. Other people have heard it, but I know you can share light on that. Before we dive into that, this is a two-part question. We saw extremism at its worst here in Pennsylvania this past Saturday, Sunday. The first night of Passover, our Jewish governor, Josh Shapiro, he was almost going to be the vice presidential nominee under the Harris ticket. Hugely popular governor here in Pennsylvania, very moderate, in my opinion.
That's very Northeast. I mean, Kerry can attest to this. Like Mitt Romney, Scott Brown, Charlie Baker. Like I would argue they're not Republicans in the traditional sense. And if you came from that area, like to your point, a conservative in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, is way different than the traditional Republican Party.
Right. So and 100%. I think people who are not keyed into local and national politics, who only obsess about national politics, they don't get the nuances of local leadership. So anyways, his house was set on fire. An arsonist lit his house on fire. I don't want to overstep with my comments. Every reporting I heard made it look like it was Molotov cocktails thrown into his house while he and his wife and his children were sleeping right after a Passover celebration. That is the worst of political extremism. So, Kerry, can we talk about the bad? And then I want you to talk about the good with all the work you're doing.
Well, I think we've seen a lot of the bad, right? We've seen a lot of what political polarization can do to motivate people to genuinely think that the other side is not just wrong on policy, to Shana's point, but are bad people and deserve bad things to happen to them. And that frees people up in some cases to act on their worst possible impulses because the other has been dehumanized. And what we're trying to do as the Forward Party is to bring the country back together and to create a center of gravity that re-embraces our core values as Americans, to focus on things as simple as defense of the Constitution, rule of law, and people don't often know what rule of law means. It simply means that the law is applied equally and fairly to every single person. And that's actually what makes us equal as citizens in the US, is that I know that I don't have any more disadvantage before the law than the president or someone else. And so rule of law, we're looking at things like people who will collaborate across the aisle in the best interests of the American people, in the best interests of their own constituents. We're looking at people who will extend grace and tolerance to those with whom they disagree. So that we're not constantly engaging in this kind of rhetoric that, that someone is not only wrong, but they're bad. We want to be able to say, we don't know what's in someone else's heart, but we disagree with this policy because we think it would be better for the American people to go in another direction. We would like to see America lead in the world and lead with ethics and morality and values and championing democracy. We'd like to see entrepreneurs prosper. We absolutely want to make sure that there's no limit to what someone can accomplish in America and that meritocracy exists. So those are the kinds of principles, and you can go to our website, at forwardparty.org and go take a look at it. Or actually, I think we're a .com because we're not a proper party yet. But we are a political movement which aims to become a federally recognized third party by the 2028 election. We have 50 elected officials who are Forwardists or forward aligned at this moment. We're on the ballot or have access to the ballot in 8 states and growing. We have organizations at a state level, so state level organizations in 38 states right now and growing. We are having state conventions. We're having a state convention in Massachusetts on May 4th, to get together and to pass bylaws and elect officers and get going on this process of trying to create a platform for independent voters and independent candidates. Right now, if you're an independent and you want to run for office, let's say, you, Brian, you'd like to run for office, but I
do not, for the record. I do not.
You're in the middle, right? You don't know whether you want to be a Democrat or a Republican, so you're just going to run as an independent. And by the way, half the voters in America say that they are independent, right? Half of them. So that means that they are actually probably the majority. And yet, if you tried to run, there'd be all these obstacles in your way. Maybe you'd have to collect more signatures than other candidates in some states. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't be able to be on the ballot. Maybe your name would be way down at the bottom somewhere. Maybe, there would be 1,000 reasons why it would be harder for you. And then the other reason would be no political consultant would work for you because they would be blackballed by the Democrats or the Republicans if they did. You wouldn't be able to raise money because you wouldn't have any lists. Like, who are these independents? Give me a list of independents. Oh, it doesn't exist. You can't even buy it, right? So what we're building is that we're building this organization of volunteers. We have 25,000 active volunteers right now, people who do get out the vote, who will do all this sort of campaigning for our local candidates. We are looking at how do you get the vendors that you need, the voting lists that you need, how do you go door to door? We're trying to build all of that. Right now, so that if you wanted to run as an independent, you would be able to come and work with the Forward Party and have an equal chance to win as would a Republican or a Democrat. Now, what is this? Why is this important? Imagine this, and then I'll stop talking for a second. Imagine if there were a half dozen independent, forward aligned, but independent candidates in Congress in this upcoming election cycle. And if it were as equally divided as it is today, that, 5-6 Congress people could literally decide every single vote. They would be able to draw both extremes in toward the middle in order to get things done. And if you had a similar situation of maybe even 2 or 3 people in the Senate, you would be able to decide on the confirmation of every single nominee. You would be able to, again, be this moderating force. And so we are looking for people who are willing to take that chance, who want to be genuinely independent, and who are going to try to put America back together again and pull it back from the extremes.
I just want to say I love that so much.
We're up against the time stop. Shana, 20 seconds, and then I was gonna say
I love that so much. In 2017, I attended the SALT conference, and Former President Biden actually was one of the keynotes, and this is, when he was very with it. And it was right after John McCain died, and he talked about his relationship with John McCain. And one of the things he talked about was, it has to come from the leadership in our political leaders, because he said the entire culture had changed, where before they all used to have lunch together. There was no this is for the Democrats, this is for the Republicans. They commingled, they went out together, they became friends with each other, and they could disagree politically, but they were always friends at the end of the day. And that has gone away completely. If you go into Congress now, there's Republican lunch area, Democrat, they never talk, they don't become friends. And the way we solve all these problems, I will say it till I'm blue in the face, is we find the commonality of which we can agree. And that will make everybody better. So I love what Kerry is talking about. I think that is much needed. I don't know if I have as much confidence that you do, Kerry, that it's possible, but I hope I'm wrong.
We're going to stick with it. Join us.
Lieutenant Governor Kerry Healey, Shana Sissel, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody listening, I hope you learned something from this conversation. You learned that we don't have to agree on everything, and that's okay. We can have conversations and debates with each other. That's what we want to accomplish. And I hope we can all take that away from this chat. Tune in next month. I have PR News Managing Editor Nicole Schumann joining, Dr. Jason Hart. I've got PR consultant Tanya McKenzie. I've got recovering PR consultant Jamie Hess, and should be a great show. Today's episode was a great show. I thank both of you, and I know we're going to continue this conversation offline here in a minute. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.